This Canada-German hydrogen alliance seems to have an element of scandal brewing within it. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by James Fleay. When it comes to energy, James has done it all. He's an Australian engineer and project manager who has worked in the power and oil and gas sectors as well as the solar industry. Most recently, he is the founder of Dune, Down Under Nuclear Energy. He's also a podcast veteran here at Decouple with 2 previous appearances to talk about hydrogen. That episode is called Hydrogen, Hype or Hope. And another very interesting one, looking more at the politics side of decoupling, which is titled "Can the Left and Right Come Together to Decouple?" I recommend both of those episodes very highly. So James, a warm welcome, but we're going to save your self-intro until a little bit later because I do have a special introduction that I need to get through. So folks, this is a breaking news situation. I just got back from Ottawa where I met with the Prime Minister, with the Minister of Labour, Minister of Procurement, deputy leaders of the official opposition, and I was talking to them about the role for nuclear energy and the need to center that in our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland's call for Canada to fast-track its energy and mining projects in order to assist our European allies in liberating themselves from petrodictators and essentially not freezing to death over the next few years. She cited as her example that we would need to sacrifice some social capital in order to do so. And I think really this means that the Liberal Party is deciding that they are going to go in on LNG and LNG exports at the insistence of their allies. But she didn't talk about LNG. She focused instead on the Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance, which was a plan announced when German Chancellor Olaf Scholz came to Canada on a tour, I think behind the scenes to beg for LNG, and was told by Prime Minister Trudeau that there was no business case for LNG and offered a Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance instead. So in short, the Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance involves building a massive wind fleet on the east coast of Canada in the Maritimes. This wind fleet would be as large as every wind turbine that is currently operating in Canada, built brand new from scratch. It would then be hooked up to electrolyzers, which would crack distilled water, highly pure demineralized water, into hydrogen molecules. Those hydrogen molecules would then be run through a number of processes, but the most essential one being the Haber-Bosch process, to create ammonia. And just remember, the Haber-Bosch process uses 1% to 2% of all global primary energy because ammonia is a vital source of fertilizer, which feeds 4 billion people around the world. No synthetic fertilizer, half the world's population starves to death. Not in 10, 20, 30 years, in 2 or 3 years. That ammonia then shipped to Germany to be burned in power plants to back up intermittent wind and solar. Today's guest has said that the Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance is the least efficient way to get electrons on the German grid imaginable. The CBC, our national broadcaster, has reported that the Premier of Newfoundland, Andrew Furey, this is the Premier of Canada's easternmost province where the Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance will be partially based, is facing scrutiny and possible allegations of impropriety or even corruption for his luxury trip to a lodge owned by Canadian billionaire John Risley. Now, John Risley happens to be one of the principal investors in the World Energy GH2 Consortium, which is looking at financing one of 3 of the large wind projects that would be part of the Canada-Germany Hydrogen Alliance. The resulting outcry has led to calls in Newfoundland to set up an ethics commissioner to examine potential conflicts of interest involving members of the House of Assembly, including the Premier. The project that was proposed by billionaire John Risley is called Nujio'qonik. It's based off of a Mi'kmaq word meaning where the sand blows. Again, this would be one of the 3 projects competing to be part of the Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance alongside EverWind Fuels in Nova Scotia and the Port of Belledune project in New Brunswick. Interestingly, the Germans said they won't take hydrogen from the Port of Belledune project because it would use electricity from the New Brunswick grid, where Point Lepreau provides a significant amount of electricity in that province. The Nujio'qonik facility, it would involve 164 onshore wind turbines, totaling 3 gigawatts of power hooked up to 1,500 megawatts of electrolyzers, which would deliver 250,000 tons of hydrogen per year in the form of ammonia. All of these projects, of course, will require some degree of provincial and federal support in order to get off the ground. And again, my guest is going to go through the business case and the energy case, or lack thereof, for this initiative. Suffice it to say that wind and solar projects around the world have been famous for harvesting subsidies and rewarding the investor class, often at the expense of the ratepayer, who have seen their electricity bills skyrocket in jurisdictions like California and Germany with the highest wind and solar penetration. In the words of one of the world's most famous investors, Warren Buffett, quote unquote, "We get a tax credit if we build a lot of wind farms. That's the only reason to build them. They don't make sense without the tax credit." Again, I was in Ottawa saying that nuclear energy must be centered in this call by Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland to fast track our energy and mining operations in order to assist our European allies. Nuclear energy is obviously the ultimate play in terms of energy security. Just within a reactor, there are 2 years of fuel as it operates, and many more years can be stored on site. In addition, there's a huge benefit not only to our European allies who are actively calling for us to assist them. We need to replace, for instance, Russian nuclear fuel exports, and Canada has a big opportunity to step in and do this. There's also unfinished reactors, Canadian reactors in Romania, where the US government will finance our government to finish those. Big opportunities here. Stay tuned for a very interesting show. And James, welcome back to Decouple.
Maybe slightly nervous after that introduction. No, not at all. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, my friend. So again, Justin Trudeau at the time of this announcement was also being asked about Canadian LNG exports. I think the visit of Olaf Scholz was really widely seen as a cry for LNG, liquefied natural gas, to replace the German natural gas pipeline flows. At that time, Justin Trudeau said there's no business case for that. I guess what I'm interested in talking with you about is whether there's a business case for the Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance. I'm really interested in picking your technical brain as a power sector engineer to look at this. So I'm not sure exactly where you want to start. I guess we'll kind of collaboratively come up with a bit of an architecture for this interview. But I'm just going to let you sort of take it away to give us some of your thoughts, maybe an overview, and then very much based on our previous discussions, looking into deep diving some of the components of this plan.
Sure. So I guess we can quickly touch on the claim that there's not a business case for LNG exports. Without being intimately familiar about the source of gas in Canada, I do know that the price differential between Canadian gas and landed LNG in Europe, based on the Dutch price, is enormous. We see similar price differentials in my own locality of Western Australia, where we have cheap domestic gas. We export large amounts of LNG, and the Japanese and Korean landed price is very good. So LNG plants are a license to print money at the moment. They're not always, but they are.
What kind of differences specifically? Do you have any numbers? So I know Henry Hub in the U.S. has been sitting, between $6. I think it went almost as high as $10. What about those Dutch prices? Where have they been sitting at?
The last I saw, they were around €50 for the same equivalent unit of energy. So I think Canada, because it's a trapped market, as far as I can tell, I believe it's even cheaper than Henry Hub prices. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say around $4. Happy to have someone prove me wrong, but it won't be wrong by much. And so there's an enormous price differential. So I don't really know why there's not a business case. Admittedly, LNG plants are expensive to build. They take a long time to build. Maybe they think the business case will disappear by the time it's built. Hard to say. But that equally applies to hydrogen. Hydrogen production, and conversion to ammonia. Not to mention the receiving facilities at the other end, and the power generation and industrial infrastructure that has to be built in Germany to use that ammonia and to use that hydrogen will also take a very long time to build, probably longer than an LNG export terminal because we haven't had as much practice. So it's a long-dated decision. When I first saw this announcement, I think it was back in maybe August. I didn't make the connection. It was about energy, to be honest. I actually thought it was about fertilizer. The press release was very short on detail, so I wasn't aware of any quantities. It just said, ammonia was going to Europe, and that made sense because Europe are really not enormous, but a not inconsequential manufacturer of ammonia, and they obviously use it for agriculture. And it sounded like there was a case to get off Russian gas and to have their own supply of fertilizer, right? But then earlier this week, I did see a press release come out that said the 2 customers in Germany that have signed non-binding MOUs. Another feature of hydrogen export projects is the non-binding nature of the MOUs. Is Uniper, so Germany's largest utility, recently nationalised, and Aeon. And I'm pretty sure these companies aren't in the business of agriculture or fertiliser. They're utilities. And so I think the game is for the hydrogen to be produced in Canada, shipped as ammonia, and to be converted to electrons when it gets to Germany to put onto the German grid. They have a shortage of electrons at the moment. It may be more acute come the winter, so there's a need. But as I said to you on our call the other day, converting a very high entropy energy like wind on the other side of the world into a high entropy source or carrier of energy like hydrogen, then ammonia, to ship it across to Germany, and then to use it with all the losses along the way, it didn't stack up at a first glance, and I've since had a closer look, and it looks even worse, to be honest.
This honestly reminds me a lot of something like the Drax plant in the UK, which is a 4 gigawatt biomass plant, which has been labeled green, has benefited from subsidies, and has involved not just in the US substantial logging. They say it's all kind of waste wood that they're burning, but again, massive logging operations in the US, in the Canadian West, for God's sakes, turning that waste wood on. There's been an investigative report in Canada demonstrating this was not just waste wood, turning it into pellets. I guess if it's being logged in the west coast of Canada, shipping it across the country onto ships running on bunker fuel, sailing across the pond, as we call it, loading it onto trains, bringing it to this massive, I guess it was a coal power plant that was retrofitted to be green and burn trees instead. With similar emissions to coal in terms of the CO2 at the stack, and similar levels of air pollution. And this is kind of yet another, for me, Rube Goldberg machine, fly-by-night attempt to really trick the public into thinking that they're doing something green and good for the environment. And there are moneyed interests that are making off like bandits, and this really frustrates me. And so again, I mean, the political nature of this is a breaking news story. I mean, this is kind of 24 hours old that these allegations against the Premier are coming out, and I want to focus much more on the technical details. But I have, and you've done a better job of briefly summarizing the kind of mechanics and the energy flows within this Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance, but I really want to get a bit more granular. So you mentioned we start with wind turbines, and I believe these are going to be on the east coast of Canada. Walk us through capturing that wind and just every step of the way, what's happening there, because I think there's some key parts of the steps that it's useful to be able to sort of look behind the curtain at and have a deeper understanding in order to really understand whether this is viable or not.
Sure. So firstly, I haven't looked, you just mentioned 3 potential projects in the Germany-Canada Hydrogen Alliance. I've not looked at these individual projects. I've attempted to. The details are scanty, except to say that wind is the primary source of energy. Where I've decided to, I guess, center the analysis is the export agreements of 500,000 tons each to Aeon and Uniper. So somehow out of the east coast of Canada, there are plans to ship 1 million tons per year of ammonia. So if we start our analysis there and we work out both ways, we'll work towards Germany and we'll work back towards Canada. So let's go to Canada first. 1 million tons of ammonia. So how much is that in ships? Well, the largest ammonia ships in the world at present are 60,000 tons. Now there may be plans in time to make bigger ones. I'm sure there might be if an ammonia economy gets off the ground. Ammonia is a much more sensible way to ship hydrogen, in my view, than liquid nitrogen or liquid hydrogen or compressed hydrogen. And so what that means is you've got about between 16 and 17 ships a year, big ships, planned to go from Canada across to Germany. So currently, at scale, there's only one process that can create industrial quantities of ammonia. Okay, that's the Haber-Bosch process. You and I have discussed that. Discussed this on the show previously. There are some benefits, I will say. There are some trade-offs. There's never a free lunch, but there are some trade-offs, and there are some benefits to using the Haber-Bosch process with an electrolyzer potentially. And there are some. Firstly, it doesn't produce CO2. So in a normal Haber-Bosch process used in the oil and gas industry, or fertilizer industry, for every 3 molecules of natural gas, about 1 molecule is used to create the energy to drive the first part of the reaction, the steam methane reforming, and 2 molecules are used as ingredients to provide the hydrogen for the actual Haber-Bosch process. So natural gas has got, CH4 has got the hydrogen atoms that you need. You need to strip them away from the carbon. You can do that with water at very high pressure, a very high temperature rather, and you can free them up into just hydrogen gas. They don't want to do that. That's why you have to use a lot of energy. That hydrogen gas is then rinsed, it's dried, and it's sent to the Haber-Bosch. It's sent to a mixer where it's mixed with nitrogen. Nitrogen is very plentiful. It's pretty cheap to make. We can make it in industrial quantities. And so the hydrogen, the nitrogen are blended, they're compressed, and they go into a reactor.
When you say compressed, because I just want to understand the energy inputs into the Haber-Bosch process, because I've heard that the Haber-Bosch process again feeds the world. 4 billion people would not be able to survive on this planet without synthetic fertilizers created by this process, and so we expend something like 1% to 2% of all of the energy from all sources that humanity creates, global primary energy, on this process. It's energy intensive. Like, why is that so? I've heard extraordinarily high pressures and pretty high temperatures in terms of process heat. And in this process, what would be providing the energy for that compression and heat?
Sure. So in the traditional Haber-Bosch process, the heat comes from one primary source, which is combustion of natural gas. And that is actually for the first part of the whole process is in short called Haber-Bosch, but actually Haber-Bosch is the last part of the process. There is a reaction before that called steam methane reforming. Steam methane reforming means that you spray steam at very high temperatures, up to 1,000 degrees, into contact with natural gas. It's really hard to heat water to 1,000 degrees. And so it uses an enormous amount of energy. Okay.
And this is where the electrolyzers making hydrogen are potentially going to save a bit of energy, potentially, to avoid the steam methane reforming.
Well, what they do is they substitute one form of energy for another.
Right.
In that process of combustion to heat up the water for steam methane reforming, not to mention the actual stripping away of the carbon from the natural gas, during the reaction, you create a lot of CO2. A lot of CO2. The electrolysis process does away with all that. It happens at a low temperature, relatively low temperature. There's no steam, but it uses an enormous amount of electrical energy to split the hydrogen in water away from the oxygen in water. The oxygen is a waste product, it goes to atmosphere. The hydrogen is moved into the next phase of the process where it's blended with nitrogen. So you do away with that front part of the reaction, but you're just substituting one sort of energy, heat, for another sort of energy, electricity. So just, I guess keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. But presumably that electricity has the potential to be carbon free, and hence the idea that we can find more environmentally friendly ways, lower emission ways to do some of these critical processes. And the arguments that I hear, from folks like Michael Liebreich and others are there are good uses for hydrogen. And also I've heard it from you actually before I heard it from them. But on our previous episode, you went into some detail on this, that, in terms of green hydrogen, whether that's from wind, solar, or nuclear, some low carbon source, we have a lot already to displace in terms of vital things like fertilizer production and as a feedstock and other vital chemical processes, and that it's best to make that hydrogen on site and use it directly in those processes instead of trying to store literally the tiniest element on the periodic table that wants to leak and embrittle and everything else. Let's leave that aside. I just wanted to throw that as a little comment, but just the next stage of the Haber-Bosch process, and I think this is interesting in terms of where this energy would come from.
Sure. So the next stage is to compress the blended nitrogen and hydrogen up to quite a substantial pressure, a range between 150 to 300 bar. Let's just call it 200. It depends on how the reactors are configured and a few other things.
For the dummies, that's 200 times atmospheric pressure essentially.
Yes. So
that's pretty high.
Yeah,
pressure.
huge pressures, and that happens. That gas is heated to between 400 and 500 degrees. Now, when you're starting up a Haber-Bosch reactor, you have to have a startup source of heat. That can be, it's just combustion of gas to get that initial heat. But once you have the reaction going, once the catalyst is hot and you're producing, you're successfully combining the nitrogen and the hydrogen into the ammonia molecule, it's actually an exothermic reaction. So the Haber-Bosch reactor itself produces heat, and you actually use that heat to preheat the gas. So, people, if they're familiar with the Haber-Bosch process, will think of the large reactors where this conversion takes place, or this reaction takes place over catalyst beds. But there's actually lots and lots of heat exchanges as part of the process as well to try and get that efficiency, to try and reclaim every little bit of useful heat possible to preheat that gas.
So in this process, in terms of the green hydrogen process, or green ammonia, so-called, you'd have to still expend a lot of energy just to get the reaction going, and that could be electricity again, although unlikely if it's an intermittent source. So probably you'd have to burn hydrogen in order to achieve that 400 to 500 degrees Celsius process heat.
I mean, technically you could do it with electricity. Heating elements can heat gas up to that temperature, but this is a really significant. These are significant industrial projects. Let's say you're talking a large amount of gas that you need to heat up before that reaction starts to become self-sustaining. And so I think it's far more likely that they either use natural gas to get started before the process produces sufficient heat, or they will use some of the ammonia they have in storage, maybe split it out to make hydrogen and try and use hydrogen as startup heat. So you've got some extra complication there, but you need that heat to get it started. And this kind of gets to something else, Chris, with the Haber-Bosch process. It needs to stay at a constant temperature and a constant pressure. It cannot be, you cannot turn it on and turn it off. You can't really even ramp it up and ramp it down very easily. You run the risk of really damaging the catalyst, and you don't want to do that. It's a significant job to shut down a reactor, replace catalyst, because you've destroyed it before the end of its useful life. So it needs to be run at a constant temperature and pressure. And this creates a little bit of a challenge when you've got an intermittent source of primary energy providing the hydrogen. You can imagine the electrolyzers, and maybe we can come back to this shortly, but the electrolyzers at the front of the process producing the hydrogen, if they are directly powered and exclusively powered with wind, even in a really good, even in somewhere like the east coast of Canada, where I understand the wind resource is really good, there are periods of time where you're in the doldrums, right? And you'll have to ramp production down. If you starve the Haber-Bosch process of hydrogen, well, you can't. You basically have to slowly shut down the process until you've got hydrogen again, and then start it back up. So, those electrolyzers need to be producing hydrogen very reliably. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. One is you can have wind combined with something else, and so your electrolyzers are running constantly. You're getting, and this is a really smart way to do it, because your electrolyzers are your most expensive part. That's your highest cost capital item, more expensive than the Haber-Bosch, more expensive than the compressors, more expensive than anything. Your electrolysis units are your biggest capital cost. Consequently, they're the part of the plant you need to achieve the highest utilization. You really need to be running them and wringing their neck. So you want to combine wind with something else. In the case of Canada, I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say Hydro-Quebec are going to be making hydrogen. I don't know if they know it yet, but hydro is a really good resource because it can ramp up, ramp down very quickly. It's highly reliable, and so I think to make this viable, the only problem in Quebec is they have these extraordinary resources, but they heat with electricity in Quebec, so they actually become net importers in the winter. Ontario and Quebec have a supply sharing agreement, or have until very recently, where Quebec provides surplus hydro in the summer when they've got just plentiful hydro, but they actually import because of these frigid winters. And they're actually talking about building new hydro because they're running out, particularly with some of their electrification goals. So it's interesting. Okay.
Obviously, there's a lot of people that talk about using nuclear to create hydrogen. I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but I think you've presented a pretty clear case as to why this is a challenging set of processes to get intermittent wind sources. I understand these are comparatively good resource capacity factors in the 40s, maybe 45% off the East Coast. Wind turbines are producing 45% of their rated power, but again, sometimes none at all in the doldrums. Turning those, using the electricity to split water, running it through turning it into hydrogen, and then running it through this Haber-Bosch process. And just briefly, explain to us why not just ship it directly as hydrogen to Germany? What are some of the challenges of storing and moving hydrogen long distances, particularly by boat?
Sure. So there's really two ways, and neither of them are very good, of concentrating the energy of hydrogen. And allowing it to keep its chemical form. The first is compression, which basically means squeezing the gas in big compressors and putting them in very, very high strength steel pressure vessels. And so, this is, there are limits to how big you can make pressure vessels. that can safely withstand that amount of pressure. And so there's real challenges with compressed hydrogen. Its energy density at safe working pressures is comparatively low. Liquid nitrogen is better.
Hydrogen, right?
Sorry, liquid hydrogen is better. But it still requires, I've seen different reports on different designs of ships and how low the temperature is going to go, because of course, you can use a combination of temperature and pressure to try and achieve stability in the liquid hydrogen. But you can go down to as low as, I think, minus 230, minus 240. I've seen some proposals. Again, no one's shipping hydrogen at the moment, so we don't know how that's actually going to happen. But these are the sorts of challenges they're coming up against. That is an extraordinarily low temperature, to manufacture, even though it's low pressure, but to manufacture materials that can reliably contain, not embrittle, not leak, for those pressures for those temperatures rather is a real challenge. Whereas,
and I'm remembering just from my first year physics courses and chemistry courses I had to take to get into med school, and long since have stopped using on a daily basis, that absolute zero Kelvin is minus 271, minus 273 Kelvin. So we're within 20, 30 degrees of absolute zero. And just super briefly, what is absolute zero? I mean, how cold are we talking, and how does that compare to natural gas?
Yeah, I mean, natural gas is about minus 160 when you turn it into LNG.
To liquefy.
Yeah, to liquefy it, right? And that's a really energy intensive process just by itself. But you can be at more or less atmospheric pressure, minus 160 degrees, really high energy density. By the time you store it for a little while, you set it to Japan and Korea, in our case, it works. It makes sense. Hydrogen, again, there's no hydrogen tankers. There's not a big fleet of hydrogen tankers around the world. I believe there is one hydrogen tanker, much smaller vessel that's operating out of Australia. But it's not. You have to go to store it at atmospheric pressure. You would have to go down to minus 250 degrees. It's getting extremely close to absolute zero. Now you can store it at a slightly higher temperature than that, but then you've got to start storing it at a higher pressure to maintain the stability of the liquid, right? So it doesn't boil off into a gas. And so there's always this trade-off. Do we go super cold, or do we go really cold but a little bit of pressure, or do we go not that cold and super high pressure? So it's like a sliding scale you can use.
Gotcha.
Ammonia, on the other hand, can be shipped at minus 10 degrees. It's shipped all the time now. We know how to do it. There's dedicated ammonia ships around the world. There's lots of infrastructure for it. Perhaps not in the quantities that some people are envisioning, but we know how to ship ammonia, so it makes sense.
You've mentioned there's a shortage of molecules in Europe in terms of the fossil fuels they use for heating and transportation, et cetera. There's a shortage of electrons, shortage of electricity. I mean, globally, we're facing a global fertilizer shortage, and we've seen countries melt down, like Sri Lanka, where it was actually more of just a political decision to try and phase out synthetic fertilizers over the crash course of something like a year. But because of these cripplingly high natural gas prices, a lot of fertilizer plants, particularly in Europe, have had to shut down. And so we're facing a global shortage of precisely what they're talking about making with the Canada-Germany hydrogen alliance, ammonia. And the plan, as you're saying, based on the utilities, the non-binding MOUs that have been signed, it looks like the plan is to ship it over to Germany, which you said, again, is kind of a viable part in shipping ammonia, much easier than shipping hydrogen. But then to burn something that is in an absolute shortage, and again, something upon which half of the world's population depends on to live. Like, there would only be 4 billion people on this earth if we were doing organic agriculture and had no synthetic fertilizer inputs. So, I mean, to me, this just seems absolutely bonkers that you would burn ammonia. Am I getting anything wrong?
No, you're not getting anything wrong. I guess the only question in my mind is maybe Aon and Uniper are going into the fertilizer business. Maybe we've got that wrong. Maybe they're not going to use this for electricity. But as far as I can tell, they're utilities. Certainly they were previously, and it looks like that's going to be used for either heat energy or electrical energy.
Right. I mean, certainly there's this category error where hydrogen is thought of as an energy source rather than energy carrier. I think many people, including some of our most senior politicians, make this category error and basically think that methane or natural gas is interchangeable with hydrogen. They're just the same things, but hey, there's no carbon in hydrogen, which of course, as you've shown us, is not true. It's actually something that needs to be manufactured with significant energy inputs.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Chris. People confuse the source of the energy with the energy vector. Mm-hmm. There's only ever been two sources of energy. One is sunlight, and you can have ancient sunlight. And here I'm stealing some terms off Nate Hagen's because I think they're really cool and easy to understand. Ancient sunlight's oil, gas, coal. You can have old sunlight, which is wood, peat, and you can have recent sunlight, which is solar. It is wind, because the sun drives the wind cycle. Hydro, because the sun drives the water cycle. But at the end of the day, the sun's the primary source of energy. Okay, so ancient sunlight in the form of hydrocarbons is providing the vast majority of the world's energy. It has for the last 100 years. And that's what natural gas is. It comes out of the ground as a really useful low entropy fuel. The other form, of course, is, we can maybe get to this later, is from the deaths of ancient stars, and that's nuclear and geothermal to a lesser extent. But so there's the energy vector in this case we're talking about is really complicated because you're going from wind to electricity to you have to produce water, you have to produce hydrogen, and you have to produce nitrogen. So that to produce hydrogen, you have to produce a reasonable volume of water. So that needs energy to be produced. And
pure water, right? I mean, we're talking like distilled water if we're running it through this process.
Super pure. So I'm assuming that this is going to be located on the coast and it's going to be using seawater, but perhaps they're planning to use fresh water. I don't know. Regardless of which, it has to be demineralized water. Now, if you're converting seawater to demineralized water, you can't do that with reverse osmosis. You need mechanical vapor compression. That's more energy intensive, and so there is an energy cost to convert wind into electricity into mechanical energy to make the water. All right, so that's a complicated part of the vector.
So yet another process here.
Then you've got the nitrogen. You've got to make the nitrogen. That's reasonably modest compared to the hydrogen, but you're still converting wind energy to electrical energy, and then eventually into, I would say, a low entropy ingredient, which is pure nitrogen that doesn't exist in nature. And then hydrogen. Hydrogen's like that's well and truly the most energy intensive part of this process. And you're converting wind into electricity into pure hydrogen. That's a really low entropy chemical. It just doesn't exist in nature in that form, but we manufacture it. And so by the time you get to this point, you've spent an enormous amount of energy, and you're not even at the Haber-Bosch process yet. Right. So then you go through the Haber-Bosch.
Yeah.
No, sorry, you had a question.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so then you compress the mixed gas up. You go into the Haber-Bosch process. You need electrical, so wind to electricity to mechanical compression for there. Luckily, you do get some heat energy back from the process, being an exothermic reaction, so that's good. And then you go through some flash chambers on the back, and you drop down the pressure and the temperature of the ammonia, and it's condensed basically into a liquid, and you store it as a liquid. About minus 30, 35 degrees, fairly low pressure. It's less than 5 atmospheres, 5 bar, and it stores pretty well. It doesn't weather, it doesn't boil off, so you can store it for pretty long periods of time
and ship it. So we're almost done with this process, and I think it's instructive that it takes us 15-20 minutes maybe to just analyze it, break it down, talk about all of the energy flows that go into it. And again, this is why I often refer to these sorts of schemes as Rube Goldberg machines. There are far simpler ways to do this. Obviously, one of them is not friendly to the climate, and one is, and that's why I'm a nuclear energy proponent. We could just leave nuclear reactors running in Germany. Our colleague Noah Retberg has run calculations on what this looks like energetically, and essentially it's the equivalent of rebuilding or doubling our entire wind fleet we've ever built across the country on the maritime coast. Again, running us through this process. If we burn that ammonia in Germany, it will equal the output of ISAR 2, which is one of the 3 remaining German nuclear stations in terms of electrons on the grid over there. But, James, there's more. But wait, there's more. If you want to combust ammonia, how do you do it? Can you just light it on fire in a nice clean power plant? Or what happens?
You definitely can't. You definitely can't. So now we've got the ammonia on the ship, and it's headed to Germany. And it gets to Germany. And so what do we do? How do we turn it into useful energy? Not food, that would be more useful, but let's say electrons on the grid or heat. Now, ammonia is combustible, but it's not easily combustible. And what do I mean by that? Now, I will say very quickly, my background, I'm an electrical engineer. I happen to work with some of the very best process engineers in the world, and I've worked alongside some very good combustion engineers. We have lots of gas turbines and fired heaters in my industry, and so I've got to work alongside them. The problem with ammonia is you can't easily achieve a stable flame, and you really need for pieces of equipment like a gas turbine, you need a stable flame. You need a fast. You need your flame speed, your flame travel speed needs to be high, and you need a stable flame. We haven't achieved that with ammonia. There is no 100% ammonia-fired gas turbine. The Japanese, IHI, are doing some work, development work at the moment. They're pushing up to 70%. Again, this is a prototype. This is a very long way from being commercial, but we don't have. We can't put ammonia into a turbine the same way we could put natural gas, or even pretty soon we'll probably be able to put hydrogen into a turbine. So you can spray ammonia into coal plants. The Japanese have been doing that successfully, trialing that recently, where you can spray.
You can spray fertilizer essentially into a coal plant.
Yep. That's right.
Like this is in the context of people potentially starving over the next year or two, with the compounding effect of, decreased Ukrainian imports of wheat. We had Doomberg on, and he went through, the way that this whole energy crisis and supply chain shortage is threatening, potential, not global famine, but localized famines all over the world in terms of whoever can't afford to buy imports. If you're vulnerable in imports, if you don't have enough fertilizer, if you don't have enough diesel or propane to dry out your seeds, if you don't have AdBlue, which is what a lot of sophisticated diesel machines require in order to run to meet emissions targets that will actually even let the vehicle operate, go back to that Doomberg episode to learn more about that. But this idea of, again, burning fertilizer in a coal plant in order to be green is even more preposterous than this biomass burning facility. I think it's the largest thermal station in the UK, logging the world's forests, turning them into pellets to burn there and claiming they're green.
The Western, and it's not just the West world, I guess, but we're particularly bad culprits. But the rich world is so blinded about our concern for carbon that we are completely blind to the challenges that the developing world face every day, just feeding themselves. And it's. People don't make the connection between energy and food. In our own societies, the connection you have with food is when you go to the shopping center or you go to a takeaway facility. It's always there. Of course, that's not the case. It gets grown, and we are using ammonia for its least valuable application.
In this process. I mean, that grocery store analogy is brilliant. I think about this all the time, right? The city person who, goes to the grocery store, picks up their chicken, picks up their veggies, and, or even the child growing up in the city who is shocked to learn about farms and animals and, even animal slaughter and turns into a vegetarian. Or, again, just I'm really grateful in my own life that I've been able to take my child out since the age of about 1.5 to a great big sheep farm and have them see, the life cycle and see lambs being born and sheep dying. Sometimes they're really good at dying, et cetera, right? And appreciate where his food comes from. But there's something so analogous with energy where, our governments are racing to put in electric charging stations, and you think that's where the green energy transition ends. And there's no thoughts given over to the power generation behind it. And I think, you and I, And this was something that came up in a Mark Nelson episode, our masterclass on coal. One of the lines that we came up with was you have to put some respect on the name of coal. If you want to replace a fossil fuel and you don't understand all that it offers in terms of all of these services that it offers, then you have no chance in hell of making the right choices to find that replacement. And probably there's some fossil fuel uses that we will never be able to replace or are centuries or maybe even a millennia away.
Yeah, I think that's true.
That Václav Smil line, there are 4 pillars of civilization: cement, steel, fertilizer, and plastic, which are all critically fossil fuel dependent. And of course, we can have these demonstration projects, right? And we might find a process around it. But when you go to scale, to feeding 8 billion people, to trying to keep the lights on or have everyone having electricity, they're simply not scalable, certainly on a 6 years notice or 12 years notice or decades or centuries. And that's not me being a climate denier or someone who's not concerned about climate or wants to move on it as aggressively as possible. That kind of energy realism is driving my enthusiasm to advocate for a power source that can not replace all fossil fuel services, but essentially do it the best. Like that's why I do what I do.
Fossil fuels are a hard act to follow, Chris. They're a hard act to follow. Yeah. They are so versatile. They're so low entropy. They come out of the ground in near perfect form. We've got 150 years of technological development to make use of them, both in their chemical form and as a form of energy, whether it's electricity, whether it's, mechanical transport, you name it. They're a hard act to follow. You and I are obviously both supportive of nuclear. I'm a big proponent of nuclear, but, and it's got a huge role to play. But, our society is, again, as Nate Hagens likes to say, it's energy blind. We don't even make the connection that what we're really talking about here is shipping electrons to Germany from Canada. That's what it comes down to, and we're finding the most torturous path to do that with. We mentioned when the ammonia gets to Germany. When
the Germans have not excess electrons on their grid, but they have a vital source of stable electrons on their grid, which they're critically dependent on, which they're vandalizing and shutting down unnecessarily. It took the severing of that final tie, that direct tie between Germany and Russia of the Nord Stream pipelines. That's what it really took when it comes down to the energy realpolitik for Germany to finally say, okay, we're actually going to extend our 3 remaining nuclear plants just through the winter till April. I think we're going to see ongoing extensions and some sense come back to that country. And those plants extended for decades, and the plants that were recently shut down restarted. And I'll fight for that. But just to emphasize again, we're shipping electrons to a country that is happy to vandalize the electrons they have. And again, coming back from Ottawa, our Minister of Natural Resources, when asked, is Germany doing everything it can? Should it be shutting down its nuclear plants? He said, nuclear plants in Germany don't decrease gas burning. Gas, he said, you're factually incorrect. Gas is used in Germany for process heat, industrial, and for heating. So nuclear plants do not displace gas. That was his line, right? And that's contradicting. And so he said, it's their internal affairs. I will not comment. I will not condemn it, right? You had Greta Thunberg a month and a half later condemning the German government for shutting down its coal plants because of the way it's pivoting, shutting down its nuclear plants because of the way it's pivoting to coal. And it's like, okay, that's a false premise. Clearly the Germans are burning gas. They're burning a bit less of it because they're burning more coal because they just don't have the gas. But you're a natural resource minister who's climate concerned. Even if nuclear was just displacing coal, you should be clapping your hands. But instead, nothing. And I mean, and that's, this minister has become more pro-nuclear, I think, actually, even just since my visit to Ottawa. I was at the Canadian Nuclear Financing conference that the CNA put on, the Canadian Nuclear Association put on, and he said the most bullish things I've ever heard him say about nuclear. Still a little lukewarmish for my liking. But I said, that's not enough. You need to align yourself with, the world's most celebrated climate heroine, Greta Thunberg, and actually make a stance here. I think we can all say that nuclear is better than coal anywhere in the world, but particularly in Germany, where they have the best run nuclear plants in the world. Speech over. James, back to you.
Well, I would say, the devil's in the detail, Chris, and I agree with the broad sentiment of what you're saying, no question. But there are applications for coal and gas, particularly around heat and high-grade, ultra-high-grade heat that nuclear doesn't fill. And so, there is something to, and obviously, particularly gas, but also coal to a lesser extent, are also useful ingredients because of those hydrogen and carbon bonds. So there are applications for those two hydrocarbons that nuclear can't fill in the near term, and will likely never fill as cheaply, to be honest. But when it comes to electricity, Maybe all of this ammonia, there's 1 million tons a year that Canada is planning to ship to Germany of ammonia. Maybe not all of it is for electricity, right? Maybe some of it's for heat. I'd much prefer if it was for food, because there's people in the world who need it a whole lot more. But let's say some of it is for heat. At least some of it's also for electricity. We know that the Germans have a massive dependence on gas, basically to fill in the gaps between sunlight and wind. They've got a high penetration of intermittent renewables, and there is unequivocal evidence now from multiple places around the world, including Australia, as solar and wind go up as a portion of grid penetration, so does gas. So, I don't know what portion of this 1 million tons of ammonia is going to be combusted to make electricity, but it's not zero.
Okay, so 3 thoughts I have to deal with here. I guess the first is, again, more philosophic. Like, for me, as someone who remains a climate hawk, my initial theory of change, my initial model was, I think, very common on the progressive environmental left. We just have to convince everyone. Not everyone's taking this seriously. We just need to do dramatic, Extinction Rebellion type action, so everyone's going to realize how they're all going to die if they don't do something next, right? I'm not saying I was an Extinction Rebellion activist. I wasn't, and I was appalled by them gluing themselves to public transportation, for instance, in the subway in the UK, in the tube, okay? And as I've become more and more educated on energy, there's this kind of tragedy to climate change where a certain amount is, it already is inevitable. There's no doubt about that. There's inertia in the system where you start looking at, the IPCC modeling, and everything ends in 100 years, and they're always just kind of trying to find ways to curve the line to achieve this net zero, which I honestly don't think is possible. And it relies on ridiculous stuff like enormous amounts of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, growing crops, cutting down enormous numbers of trees, and burning them and capturing the carbon, I guess, is how we're going to balance out the equation. Or things like direct air capture. We've done a show on that with Sean Wagner. Reverse geoengineering, essentially. And that's, to me, it's like this, I'm very concerned about climate change. I have a 4-year-old son. There are real changes that we will see at 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. The Amazon will turn into a savanna, for God's sakes. At least, it's multifactorial. We will see some sea level rise. It may be dramatic. It may not be as dramatic. There's a plethora of changes. We're going to see stresses on civilizations, probably big changing attitudes towards refugee flows, all kinds of things. This is concerning. Not just concerning, we can say it's terrifying on a long-term basis. But there's this tragedy to it, which simultaneously, if we were to follow the dictates of Extinction Rebellion or the No New Oil people in the UK, 4 billion people would die in 2 or 3 years because there'd be no fertilizer. and this appreciation from folks that are frankly climate skeptics, right? That, methane or natural gas is the food of food. The world becomes a lot more complex. And I think it's just a journey as you age in general, the world's less black and white. And I remember as a youth looking up to my elders and saying, you've sold out, like, where's your passion gone? And being frustrated by that. I haven't lost my passion, right? And I do realize how humble, my interjections are, because even if I'm able to save a nuclear plant here, it was 1% of Canada's all sector emissions. Not bad, right? But it's on the grand scale of the world's emissions. There's a lot to do. So philosophical rant over. Next thing is just briefly.
Pickering's a bit more than not bad. I think that's right. An extraordinary achievement.
Thank you, sir.
That's just remarkable. But I mean, let's quickly finish.
I did just want to get on one thing here, which is burning ammonia at high temperatures. There's nitrogen there. You're turning it into nitrous oxides, which are an ingredient in smog, worsen asthma and air quality. It's not like ammonia is squeaky clean. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, that's correct. So, and that's one of the challenges with ammonia combustion. It's not just the stability of the flame. It's also, it has the potential to be 100 times more concentrated in NOx, so oxides of nitrogen, than natural gas. And so,
100 times.
this is not. This problem isn't solved, but work is being done. And there are some technology companies. No, they're not technology companies. They're industrial companies in Europe, North America, Japan, who are looking at ammonia very seriously as a marine fuel. And so they're already going down the path of selective reductive catalysts for the exhaust to manage nitrogen. It's a difficult problem, but it's being worked on. The big challenge, like if we step back and look at the energy vector again, we say we've landed the ammonia in Germany, it's off the ship, it's in these big old tanks. What do we do with it? Is okay, maybe some of it will be used as fertilizer. That would be terrific. Maybe they'll convert the ammonium into fertilizers that can be then transported to other countries. Like ammonium phosphates, ammonium sulfates. That sort of thing. That would be great. But any ammonium they actually plan to use, ammonia, sorry, they plan to use for energy, I believe they're going to convert to hydrogen first. I believe they have to convert it to hydrogen first. There is a near-term pathway for very high hydrogen content combustion in combined cycle gas turbines. I think 100% will probably be achieved before this decade is out. So I think they'll convert the ammonia back to hydrogen. But there's a problem here. You remember when we said back in the Haber-Bosch process, it was an exothermic reaction. It actually released heat. Yeah. Well, we're now doing it back to front. That means we need to put heat into it. And it's a lot of heat. God. And so to crack the hydrogen, and again, the details are scanty. I hope maybe someone from Uniper or E.ON will reach out to you and say, no, that's not what we're doing. We're doing it differently. I hope to be corrected. But if they're going to crack the hydrogen out of the ammonia, which is the most practical industrial scale vector that I see, then they're going to suffer a loss of about 20% of that hydrogen. Okay, some of it's literally just lost through losses in the process, and the rest of it is combusted as heat in order to drive that process. So straight away you're getting a 20%, and this is using German technology, ThyssenKrupp's ammonia cracking technology, which is supposedly among the best. You lose 20%, and so you compound that with all the losses that you've suffered along the way, from everything from the wind now to the hydrogen being sent to these new power stations that Germany's going to build that can take it. And I've sort of got all the calculations here in front of me. And I also will just quickly give a little bit of recognition to a terrific study from University of Oxford back in 2015, where they really laid out ammonia from wind as an energy vector in a lot of detail. So I've really lent on that. as well as the Ammonia Energy organization website. They're very pro ammonia and pro ammonia in particular, but their technical papers are excellent. So they're the two sources I've used to do this sort of series of calculations. But the University of Oxford found that in terms of electrons to electrons, so the electrons produced by the wind to the electrons available to the consumer, right, is 23%.
Through this whole process.
Through this whole process, excluding shipping.
The Canada, excluding shipping. The Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance.
No, this was a
20% efficient.
This is 2015 study, and so their study looked at wind turbines with an ammonia storage system on the side connected to the grid. They weren't transporting the ammonia. They were using it to store it and then later combust it back onto the grid.
As hydrogen or as ammonia?
They had done the calculations based on ammonia combustion, but I can't find any viable technology for that. There are theoretical values, of course.
And what percent efficiency did you say?
They found 23%.
Again, and you're taking an electron that you're making with a wind turbine, running it through all these processes, combusting to make another electron at the other end.
Yep.
And you lose...
So every
77% of the energy.
Correct. So every 100 electrons
without transporting it.
Yep.
This is insane. I mean, this is like, is there a net energy loss to this whole process? And like, we have to bridge, because I'm going to keep you on longer than the average episode here, James, because this is, I'm enjoying this deep dive, but we have to get to the grifters who are going to harvest the subsidies on a process which, from what you're saying, I mean, the shipping is going to add a bunch to this. We're, again, potentially really not even pulling much net energy out, right? Even if we use it for fertilizer, I'm guessing that it might even be lower emissions just to use the methane for fertilizer than this Rube Goldberg machine, right? Even if we do the ethical thing and use this ammonia to feed the world, as we should be doing. But yeah, who benefits? And I mean, again, this is where there's a potential scandal, political scandal brewing in Canada, certainly on the provincial level. It may extend federally. I'm not sure. One of Canada's wealthiest businessmen, billionaire John Risley, made his fortune in the seafood industry and is now a big player in a major kind of hydrogen conglomerate, about to potentially, I think it's a $12 billion project in Newfoundland. Like, is venture capital so energy illiterate that they're putting their money into this? Is this, I don't expect you to know all these details here, but just globally, Warren Buffett, again, we have a different model here, but much of the wind in the States was financed by big banks through production tax credit, where they got to cheat the system, not pay their taxes, not pay into all of the social services that we all rely on, because they built a wind turbine, which in the end ended up making electricity very expensive and had an incredibly low value proposition in terms of deep decarbonization, as we've seen in California, where emissions are down slightly, but not very much, and they still have to use a critical amount of gas and have an unstable grid where they say you can't have an internal combustion vehicle, but 4 days later, the grid's going to crash. Don't charge your car for a few days, or the German situation, right? You couldn't make this stuff up. So what do you know? I don't know if you can comment specifically or maybe just more globally, just your thoughts, I guess, about the grifters, the rentier class that is harvesting these subsidies on a process which is immoral. I'll just call it immoral. Just a utter misallocation of resources at a time when we are supposedly needing to rush forward on climate change, where we should be rushing forward on air quality issues, etc. Going through this inefficient process and literally burning fertilizer for a trivial amount of energy, when you could leave a nuclear station on in Germany, which would be enough to power this whole ridiculous venture. Yeah, just absolutely. Leave that nuclear station on. It's perfectly good. It's one of the best run nuclear stations in the entire world. Capacity factors of 94%. The German engineers running nuclear stations, if only they ran France's stations. So rant over, what do you think about the financial side of this?
See, other than a very, very short period in, I would say, the 90s and the 2000s, and this really only ever applied to gas-fired power generation, there was this tiny little window where a few investors took merchant risk in the electricity sector. Okay. But because we've got a market, quote unquote, people think that there is competition and that investors are putting their own money at risk to build electricity assets and hoping they'll get the revenues from the market. That doesn't happen. That's never happened. There will be no money put into these sorts of projects by the investors. 12 billion, I think I heard you say before. I haven't seen that figure. That's an awful lot of money. No one puts down $12 billion without guaranteed returns. Now, they will have some risks around how they run the plant, how they deliver the project. Sure, fine. But they will have guaranteed revenue from that investment. And it won't be dependent on how much hydrogen they sell. And it won't be dependent on the market price of electricity in Germany. And it won't be dependent on the cost of wind power to deploy. Okay? So someone will be picking up the bill for this. Now, I don't know what it's going to cost. Like, you know, my day job for, you know, longer than I'd care to admit, is working for a super major integrated oil and gas company. You know, we look at these sorts of things for years, sometimes decades before we move. Okay, because they're very complex. It's very hard to be sure how much something's going to cost or if the technology is going to be viable. And often it's very hard to find a buyer at the other end, right? And you need buyers on long-term contracts, offtake contracts. So how these hydrogen and ammonia projects are being announced ahead of all of that work and ahead of those offtake agreements and ahead of viable technology demonstrations is beyond me, because it's never happened in the traditional energy sector, you know, like the one that's kept everything running for the last 150 years. So it's a departure from everything we've ever done. But that $12 billion investment, that will not be taking merchant risk. Someone will be taking risk for that, and it will either be a Canadian taxpayer or it will be a German taxpayer. They're the only two people who will be footing the bill for this at the end of the day. Now that University of Oxford study, now this is back in 2015, they were watching the price of wind turbines come down. Obviously wind picked up again in a levelized cost a couple of years ago, but they were watching wind prices come down. They were looking at electrolyzers going, okay, this is sort of where it's trending. They were taking into account some of these cost curves. And they had calculated, and they looked at all different types of catalysts. They looked at different water desalination technologies, different electrolyzer technologies. They'd said the cheapest that they could see it being done at was $253 per megawatt hour. Okay. You know, I guess,
which is about double Ontario's price right now.
I would have thought you'd be much cheaper than that.
I think we're about 11-12 cents a kilowatt hour, so it's $11 or $12 a megawatt hour, I think, right?
Yeah, I said 253 a megawatt hour.
Oh, okay, sorry. I thought you said 25.
No,
sorry,
253. So,
wow.
Like, that's what they calculated. Let's say the technology's improved. Maybe it's come down a bit. I'd be prepared to go along with that. But, you know, that's the levelized cost. I mean, you haven't got financing costs in there. You haven't got shipping costs in there. You know, that you haven't got the cost at the other end to convert it back into hydrogen. You know, they never looked at the cracking the hydrogen out of ammonia. They didn't. That was not the vector that they thought. But I believe at the scale that Germany would need it, that's what you need to do. So all these other costs. It's an extraordinarily expensive form of energy. Who pays? Who's buying it? I don't know.
Yeah, the taxpayer, the ratepayer. But someone's making a lot of money off this in the end. If it goes through, you know, and you know who pays. I mean, one example is we have this green bond in Canada, which you know lumps nuclear alongside the sin stocks of gambling, tobacco, farms, manufacturing. But you know, it does fund a wide range of projects, and a lot of them that don't really seem to offer much of a return. But hey, it's just government-backed debt. And this again, kind of historic misallocation. If Canada's green bond is used to back, you know, the private investors that are going to scoop billions off of these kind of contracts, that is a historic misallocation, and it's contradictory to doing anything about climate change. because you're forestalling effective, efficient action, namely putting a nuclear plant on the grid, decarbonizing your grid, and electrifying transportation, heating, other things directly in a very efficient process. Or what you've described. And this really, I'm a pretty cynical person. I've always thought that this announcement probably would never get built. But now maybe it will, in terms of some of the political influence that this billionaire may or may not have. I want to be very careful, not making any formal allegations of anything, may or may not have with provincial or federal politicians. But, is this a $12 billion fig leaf of virtue signaling just to justify LNG? Because, when Chrystia Freeland said we're going to fast track energy and mining projects, she highlighted the Canada-German Hydrogen Alliance. Clearly, the Liberal base is quite climate concerned, and a significant portion of it will not be happy about Canada developing its fossil fuel resources and becoming a significant LNG exporter. But clearly, the realpolitik is such that I think that's what she meant in that announcement. And she said, we will sacrifice domestic political capital to fast track energy and mining projects to help out our distressed European neighbors. And of course, my angle is, well, choose the very best ones. The best ones for Canada, the best ones for Europe. Nuclear is the ultimate energy security play for Europe. You can have at least 2 years of fuel in your reactors. You can store more on site if you want. That reactor can be there for 80 years, right? There's reactors that Canada has half built in Romania that we could finish right away. We have things we can do right away. Right, we could fill in the gap. Cameco, Brookfield Renewable Partners just acquired Westinghouse. That gives Cameco the ability to make enriched fuel, and we can continue to sanction Russia and be the supplier of Europe of that fuel. Huge economic opportunity. That Romania deal, that's can-do technology that the U.S. is going to pay for, right? As an energy security play, as a geopolitical play, this is of direct, enormous benefit. But instead, it looks like we're going to be doing a $12 billion at least greenwashing exercise for Canadian LNG, which, let's face it, it's lower carbon than coal, and I don't want my European friends freezing to death in the dark or starving because there's no fertilizers. As a climate hawk, that's kind of hard for me to say, but it is. There's energy realities out there, but
of course there is.
We can invest in nuclear, which is again the ultimate decarbonizer, which will eventually, in the kind of natural gas to nuclear progression, replace as many fossil fuels as are humanly possible to replace.
Well, the other thing too is, I also look at competitive advantage a little bit. Canada has a competitive advantage in producing nuclear fuel because of the price differential of gas between gas in Canada and Europe. If you built LNG plants on the Atlantic coast, you would have a competitive advantage because you have the molecules and the Europeans don't. Okay, but at the end of the day, like I don't see the competitive advantage that Canada has to ship ammonia produced from wind across the world. Like the Europeans already have a lot of wind, much more than the Canadians. They are the undisputed masters of building very, very, very large offshore wind installations and tying them back to their grid. I'm pretty sure if the Europeans really wanted to produce vast amount of hydrogen, let's say, from wind, they would be able to do it more cheaply than the Canadians. I'm just putting that out there. And I hope we're wrong. I hope, maybe there's a case where, particularly now that Uniper has been nationalised, maybe the German government are using it for more than just an electricity and gas utility now. Maybe they are looking for ways, ammonia has chemical applications, obviously it has fertiliser applications. Maybe they are looking to displace the ammonia that was previously produced by natural gas from Russia with, ammonia produced via wind from Canada for these applications, and it's got nothing to do with electricity or heating. I hope that's the case. It would be very interesting to run the numbers on it, but again, from the way you're describing this process, something like 23% efficient if you were just to make ammonia and burn it on site. So with the shipping, even if it was used as fertilizer,
that's going to be very, very expensive fertilizer. That's going to be, they could sell it. Greenpeace Germany could sell it as, virtue signaling fertilizer and sell it at top price to, maybe a rich country that could afford that. Pro-wind vegan gas, pro-wind, vegan fertilizer, the equivalent of their pro-wind vegan gas, where they mix some biomethane into 99% Russian gas. But when I look at Canada, we have like landlocked oil and gas in Alberta and Saskatchewan. I'm not sure if we have a big fertilizer industry there. People talk a lot about ethical oil. It's been a way to sort of try and greenwash the tar sands, which let's face it, are very energy intensive. The energy return, energy invested is not great. But there are significant gas resources in Canada. Maybe one of the most ethical things we could do with those is turn it into the things that are the hardest to replace, which is things like fertilizer. And maybe that would be cheaper, more abundant, and be able to assist the developing world in not starving, especially in the next few years. I don't know. I'm like shocked at hearing myself say this, but again, this is the kind of pragmatism which I think does achieve lower emissions rapidly, especially, because it relies on the nuclear component. I find myself, I always say my 16-year-old self would probably put a hit out on my 40-year-old self if they found out I was a nuclear advocate, and my 38-year-old self might put a hit out on my 40-year-old self for saying that maybe we should be using, Canadian natural gas and really focus on fertilizer production, which is just, yeah, okay. My 40-year-old self says, yeah, obviously we can't let people starve. We need to keep 4 billion people alive with Haber-Bosch, with ammonia. Yeah,
it's I think you've had Doomberg on your show before. I'm a subscriber. I read their stuff. One of their favorite things that they quote is, "There are no solutions. There's only trade-offs." And we have, as a society, as a world, we have trade-offs to make. And the trade-offs can't be that the poorest and neediest of the 8 billion people in the world become poorer and more needy. That can't be the trade-off. The trade-off has to be something else. I'd also leave you with one other thing, Chris. Like just as I was sort of finishing up this, look into the round trip efficiency to get electrons in the form of ammonia from Canada to Germany. I thought about where Canada does have a competitive advantage. And obviously that's fabrication of nuclear fuel. You guys are really good at that. And so I had a bit of a look at what you could do to ship nuclear fuel. Now, admittedly, I haven't looked at uranium mining and I haven't looked at fuel fabrication, energy import. I know they're relatively minor, but they're not nothing. So I haven't looked at that. But and I'm using AP1000 as a test case because there's lots of literature available for it. The German plants will be analogous, not exactly the same, but analogous. In an AP1000, it produces 1,110 megawatts nameplate capacity. Every 18 months, you swap out about 43% of the fuel. Okay, some people say a third, but actually, if you're running it that hard, it's sort of closer to 42%, 43% is the technical uppercase that I can find. So, of the 157 fuel assemblies, 68 of them are being replaced every 18 months. Now you've got a capacity factor of 90% with nuclear, and what that means is for every 18 months, you ship across 40% new fuel. Okay, the rest of the fuel stays in there, keeps making energy. And that means for every shipment, you're getting 13.126 terawatt hours. Okay, and people probably scratching their head going, well, how much really is that? That's about 7% of Australia's total electricity consumption from one reactor. Okay, over a year. That can be shipped in 68 20-foot containers. Okay, so each fuel assembly, it's in a special travel case. It fits inside a 20-foot container. You could actually fit multiple, but we'll just say 20 foot. And so, what does that mean? That means you could use a small ship. All right, I mean just like a little one that 130 meters long, and carries about 1,000 containers. That's a small ship. It'll fit into any port. That could ship enough energy if Europe had built the reactors. It could ship 183 terawatt hours every 18 months. Okay, it could fuel 14 AP1000 reactors every 18 months. Now, why am I saying this? Because it caused me to think about, well, how many ships do you need to use of nuclear fuel to send the same amount of electrons from Canada to Germany? And again, I'm happy to be corrected on the calculations. I've just used what's available in the literature. Maybe ammonia is slightly better than what I put it out there. It won't be much better. But if we combine the two calculations, we find we need 1,020 ammonia shipments. And that's for the biggest class of ammonia ship we currently have, 1,020, to provide Germany with the same amount of electrons on the grid as a single ship, small ship, filled with fresh nuclear fuel. And so I'm not saying that we should do that, by the way. And there's things complicating that, like Germany don't have the reactors to put the fuel in. But it should give people pause for thought that if we're talking about sending energy around the world, we really need to look at the densest, the lowest entropy form of energy there is to ship. 1,020 ships versus one.
And what are we doing with Drax? I mean, how many? I don't expect you to have that answer. It's a rhetorical question, but again, these green solutions, quote unquote, like bunker oil being burned, like that's the bottom of the it's not quite asphalt, right? But in terms of petroleum distillation, where it's scraping the bottom of the barrel, literally, for these highly sulfur-rich fuels, highly polluting fuels, to send boat after boat after boat across the Atlantic. Idling in ports, ruining local air pollution. I know in Los Angeles it's gotten better. They force them to burn a different fuel when they're within 50 miles of the coast or something. But I mean, this energy literacy is driving climate, air quality, and environmental own goals. I call it own goals over and over and over again. And one of my big messages in Ottawa is that the federal government is at risk of losing, and I think around the world, so-called progressive governments, who have their origins in labor, who used to be made up of actual people who'd worked in factories, who'd had engineering discipline, who understood supply chains, how the world worked. That's the history of labor-type parties. And now they've become, those folks aren't a part of their parties anymore, aren't a part of their movement. And they've been really commandeered and taken over by environmentalist organizations. We have, I forget her name, the one of the NRDC former chairwomen is the official climate advisor to the Biden administration. In Canada, 2 or 3 of the most influential people in Canadian politics are not actually the elected politicians. It's the people who staff the Prime Minister's office and World Wildlife Fund. In British Columbia, one of our large provinces, there were 2 candidates running in the equivalent of the Labour Party, the New Democratic Party there. One of them was disqualified, and it was because she used to work for the Sierra Club, and her previous environmental organizations and green environmental organizations in the province, one of them is called Dogwood, had actually paid for people's party memberships, and it was ruled that it was unfair that these outside organizations had mobilized so many members to sign up and vote for her. And there's been allegations that her disqualification was influenced by someone with oil and gas ties. I'm not saying that this is a 100% crystal clear story, but just suffice it to say, if she had won that election, who would have been her chief of staff? Who would have been advising her? What the environmental movement has done to the left, to the progressive governments around the world, even to labor. I mean, you go to some of these labor conferences and they talk about a just transition. They're being advised by environmental organizations to do things which are entirely contrary to the interests of labor. To transition fossil fuel workers to jobs in wind and solar. Look no further than my House of Commons testimony to discover the labor dystopia. Or there's a great Vice News article we're going to interview the author of soon. These are difficult to organize, transient, low-skilled jobs which are not permanent because there's no parking lots at a wind or solar facility. This is the kind of way that the left and labor has been, I think, really poisoned by an environmental movement which over and over and over again is demonstrating that they're in contrast to their stated goals and interests of reducing emissions, reducing pollution. And that's a beautiful example. The number of tankers of ammonia, or the number of huge bunker-fueled cargo ships carrying wood chips over to Drax, that big biomass plant, all of it being exempted from carbon taxes and other environmental standards, because hey, burning trees feels good. It's natural. It's green.
Apparently.
Right.
And the crazy thing is, wood is a lower entropy source of energy than wind. So you could make the case that the Canadian to German hydrogen alliance is more of a Rube Goldberg than Drax.
Wow. All right, James, this has been really fun. I like the kind of conversational format. I think we should just have you back on and spitball a little more. You know how I love to sort of break in with a rant every once in a while. It's been far too long. I believe you were last on in April of 2021. We will have you back again very soon. Just an extraordinary breadth and depth of knowledge. Engineering discipline. I mean, Emmett Penny's the one who first kind of put that on my radar, but you're a person who understands how the sausage gets made in terms of these really, modern day life-giving processes, which are complicated. And so I thank you again for being someone I can sort of speed dial. 1 second here. Decline. Someone who I can speed dial across, vast oceans, across continents, and ask your opinion, and we can, in 24 hours schedule this kind of a meeting. So James, I know it's late for you in Australia. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Real pleasure having you, my friend.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for reaching out. I look forward to it, to the next discussion, whenever it is.